This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And I'm Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we're back. Arab Talk is back from a little spring break, and we have so much to talk about today. And perhaps at the top of all of our minds, all of our listeners and viewers who kind of tune into Arab Talk, we're thinking about the 75 years commemoration of the Nakba, the catastrophe of Palestine, when over 800,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced from their homes, over 550 villages destroyed, ethnic cleansing, murders. It was catastrophic for Palestine and for Palestinians. And 75 years on, we're going to take stock of, what's happening with that in part of our discussion today. It's important to commemorate that, especially in light of the kind of apartheid state that is taking hold in the parts of historic Palestine. So we're going to talk about that. And before we get to that, Jamal, we're going to talk about kind of a very interesting event that happened at City University in New York, CUNY, at the law school, where they live streamed the commencement ceremony where Fatima Muhammad was speaking. And she was wearing the traditional Palestinian kufiya. Hours after the ceremony, the video of the speech disappeared, surprisingly, from the website of the law school. It made its way back, and it has caused quite a controversy, as is no surprise to any of us. We're going to talk a little bit about Fatima, her speech, her commencement address. And by the way, the commencement speaker is chosen by the students.
That's right.
So, she was picked, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And of course, we have to talk about the, quote, only democracy in the Middle East, the Israeli justice minister. This is a quote from our huge ally, the only democracy in the Middle East, the apartheid state. The justice minister Levine said, and I quote, Arabs are buying apartments in Jewish towns in Galilee, leading Jews to leave them as they don't want to live with Arabs. We need to make sure that the Supreme Court justices who understand that Jews do not want to live with Arabs. That's a direct quote of Minister Levin. So, the Galilee is a historic Palestinian Christian town, by the way, Jamal, as we all know, the Galilee area. What a crazy comment. But
here is
with all that said,
the crazy comment, which we'll come back to it later on, but this is the Galilee, which witnessed major ethnic cleansing in 1948 during the Nakba, which we will talk about it now. And now this minister coming and saying that the Arabs are buying too many homes in Jewish neighborhoods. I mean, think about it. I just want people to pause and think about this racist statement. I mean, these are people who were ethnically cleansed, and now they're, of course, population expansion. They need to buy apartments and homes, and they don't want them to live in Jewish neighborhoods.
But we should talk about that, because there's a direct line, Jamal, from what happened in 1948 to where we are today in the apartheid state, when a minister of an apartheid government, the apartheid Israeli state, can come out and say, we want Supreme Court justices to understand that Jews don't want Arabs, otherwise known as Palestinians, buying homes in Jewish neighborhoods. There's so much wrong with that statement, so many things.
And we should mention the so-called Arabs, which are what we call the 1948 Palestinians, they're indigenous Palestinians, are Israeli citizens. Just to also to clarify this, because you hear the Israeli Hasbara saying that, everyone is equal under the law. There is no discrimination. And then when they want to wiggle their way out of the atrocities they commit basically in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, they said, no, this is different. In the West Bank is different, but in Israel, meaning, pre-1967 borders, everyone is treated equal.
But that's why the Galilee story is so important, Jamal, because as you said, the Hasbara, especially in light of the protests that have been going on in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem against Netanyahu and his revision of the judicial system, and all this talk all over the world, people are wringing their hands about, oh, what's happening to Israel and the apartheid state. Oh, my God, we need to save democracy. The reality is that since 1948, there has not been a democracy. There's never been a democracy. And the situation, there's never been a democracy for everybody. Let me just be very clear about it. If you're Jewish, you happen to have democracy. But if you're Palestinian, if you're Christian, if you're Muslim, if you're of any other racial or ethnic or religious affiliation, that democracy is hands off. And that's why this story in the Galilee is so important. You put your finger on it, Jamal, because if these are Israeli citizens, Jamal, who are living in the Galilee, why shouldn't they have the freedom and the right to buy property wherever they want in historic Palestine? But that's not the case. You have Minister Levine who wants the Supreme Court.
We don't have to go. We don't have to go far, yes, and just reverse the clock a little bit here to pre-1960s, and when African Americans were prevented from buying homes in white neighborhoods or riding in the buses. That's the same system. That's why when we talk about apartheid, and then there are, unfortunately, a lot of people who bury their heads in the sand and pretend and keep repeating that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and ignore totally what's going on the ground. But anyway, let's go back to our main story, Jess. As you've introduced and mentioned, every year on May 15th, Palestinians mark a somber occasion, which is the Nakba, which means the catastrophe in Arabic, that befell Palestinians in the lead up to and during 1948, when they were ethnically cleansed and expelled from their ancestral homes and lands by Zionist gangs. And, we had a mass expulsion that ensued, where hundreds of villages, you mentioned this, but you're right, over 500 villages were depopulated, homes were destroyed. There are, I know Palestine. I traveled quite a bit in it, and there are villages that exist that have been turned into parks, and it's so devastating to go there and see the remnants of these villages with outgrown trees. They try to cover them up with pine trees, which are not indigenous to the area, so you don't see them from the major highways, but they do actually exist. And of course, thousands of Palestinians were killed by Jewish gangs, the Irgun, the Haganah, the Stern gang militias, and others who committed just a series of mass atrocities, including dozens of massacres. I want us to talk a little bit about these massacres, because people, they think, even Palestinians, when they talk about the massacres that happened, and we keep uncovering more and more, and actually recently they've uncovered mass graves.
That's right.
Palestinians think about Deir Yassin, which is, but there were dozens of other massacres that happened. I kind of like to talk about, of course, we'll talk about Deir Yassin, but I'd like to talk about the lesser known massacres that happened in towns and villages. And by the way, there is the Zionists are all up in arms, because recently there was a film about Tantura, right? So,
right,
and I'm not going to talk about that, because I just encourage people to watch the film.
Yeah, it's an important film, and I think it's even done by an Israeli filmmaker who did this.
Well,
film,
yeah,
right?
It's out there, so people can watch it, and that's why they're all upset about it. But
up in arms,
I want to mention a few of these massacres, Jess, and maybe we talk about maybe 5 of them. Starting with the village of Balad al-Sheikh. Balad al-Sheikh, that's the name of the village, which on December 31st, 1947. So this is early in 1948. They witnessed the first large attack by the Haganah Zionist militia against that village. That village is located east of the port city of Haifa. So I'm not going to even talk about the mass expulsion in Haifa, that now Palestinians live in only one neighborhood, which is the Nusnas neighborhood in Haifa. Everybody else was driven from the nice Carmel mountain with the views, so now they are right at the foothill. So in this massacre, this is one of the earliest massacres, 60 to 70 Palestinians were massacred. I'm taking this information from Walid Khalid's book, All That Remains. That's also another book that I encourage people to read. So what they've decided when they raided the village, the orders were given to basically the Palmach, which is a force of 170 Israelis from the Palmach, which is considered the elite force of the Haganah. And they gave orders to massacre and kill as many adult males as possible.
Yes.
So they came, killed the men, blew up the houses, pulled out all the adult males and shot them in public. So there are many eyewitnesses who have seen this, a lot of surviving women who ended up living, some of them in refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan. They've witnessed this. And of course, there were documented at least 2 women and 5 children were also killed, and 40 people were injured. And of course, the town was destroyed during the attack, and forcing the rest, of course, the villagers to leave. And that's why people would say, well, how come you have so many Palestinian refugees? Well, that's one example.
Well, can I let me just say something about that, Jamal? A couple of things which is really important. This is Balad Sheikh. You described the Haganah and the Palmach as Israeli forces, but let's, just for the sake of clarity, there was no Israel in 1947.
No, these are Zionist gangs.
These are Zionist thugs and just another level of detail in terms of the history here, who, with a wink and a nod from the British colonial rule at the time, were actually allowed the opportunity to get these weapons. They weren't, there's some evidence to suggest that the British occupying forces, not necessarily collaborated with this, but were aware of these thuggish, murderous gangs. And this goes to show our viewers and listeners, Jamal, that this was a coordinated effort that started well before 1948 to depopulate and cleanse indigenous Palestinians from the land. The other point, just to be really clear, why would they go and shoot the men? In part, one is trying to send a message, right, to the other villages around, that these murderous Zionist gangs could be coming out after other villages. This was part of that coordinated effort to instill fear in the population, and obviously it didn't work because it took many months afterwards before the more coordinated effort in 1948. But we'll get to that. But I think it's important for our listeners and viewers to know that there was no Israel in 1947. And the other thing, Jamal, I'm sorry to free associate here, the majority of people on the land in historic Palestine in 1947, Palestinians. The majority of landowners in 1947, Palestinians. So this was a majority historic Palestine was majority Palestinian at the time when these murderous thugs were doing their reign.
And another book I want to mention, Jess, which we talked about it quite a bit, is actually 2 books. One also by Rashid Khalidi is The Iron Cage, and the other one is by Israeli historian Ilan Pappé, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, in which he discusses a systematic plan to ethnically cleanse the land, starting with Plan Dalit. It wasn't like a coincidence, and they tried to make it like there was a war between Arabs and Jews and whatever. It wasn't. It was a very synchronized plan to basically drive fear, kill as many people, drive them away from their homes, and that's how these villages were emptied out. And
right.
By the way, Balad Sheikh was considered before the massacre in 1945. The village was the second largest in historical Palestine in terms of population amongst these.
Wow.
Because going back 1945, you had a lot of small villages, and if you said more than 500 of these villages were ethnically cleansed. The second lesser known massacre that happened is in Sa'sa. That's the village of Sa'sa, or the town of Sa'sa. And they had two massacres were carried out by the Haganah. This is 1948. One in mid-February and another one in October. So the first one, the community massacre, killed a lot of people. Again, was raided by the Palmach force and detonated explosives inside several homes, destroying 10 homes and killing tens of people. This is according to the Haganah estimates. This is coming from the archive, Israeli archives. And even the New York Times at that time reported that the number of people were killed, including 5 children, and 14 houses were destroyed. However, the villagers stood their ground, didn't leave.
Wow. So
they came back again in October. Okay, now a larger force in October 30th of that year, 1948. And this is, again, from the mouth of the enemy. This is coming from Israel Galilee, the former head of the Haganah National Staff, who brags about the numbers that people were killed and the details. He details the accounts of the killings. And of course, the village eventually got depopulated because of the second massacre. Because before 1948, the village was known for being an intersection that linked many urban centers, including the big city of Safad, which basically it was dotted with water springs, apple, olive trees, grapevines. And in 1949, an Israeli settlement by the same name was established on the village site. So if you go there,
unbelievable.
The village exists, but it's depopulated of its indigenous population, which is the Palestinians. So again, this is very important because people, even I said, a lot of Palestinians don't know that. And sometimes you drive by and you see an exit for the town, Sa'sa, this is a Palestinian village, and you go there isn't a single Palestinian living in it. Why?
And well, yeah, but and the other tragedy and the other kind of visual atrocity, Jamal, and this goes back to the name of Rashid Khalidi's book, All That Remains. And you and I have done this drive where you drive around these areas and you may exit to a city or to an illegal settlement, and you'll see the remains of the depopulated, ethnically cleansed city still there. You'll see the homes. You'll see stones of the homes. You'll see little walls. You'll see the remnants, the remains, as Khalidi said, of these depopulated, ethnically cleansed villages. So the visual evidence of the atrocity is still there, Jamal.
That's why we remember 75 years later. And that's why it's very important for us to talk about this. I mean, we don't have in this hour, we can only talk maybe about 5, Jess. And you've mentioned 500. So let me go to the next village, this is the famous or infamous massacre, Deir Yassin, which happened on April 9th of 1948, where more than 110 Palestinian men, women, and children were slaughtered in one of the most heinous crimes carried out by the Zionist forces. And this was a once prosperous village of Deir Yassin because it's on the western outskirts of Jerusalem. So if you're heading to Jaffa, which is basically another prosperous town, Jerusalemites would travel in the old road. Now Israel calls it Highway 1. There was also a railroad track, and if you traveled by bus, by car, you passed by Deir Yassin. You could stop there and kind of have a picnic or rest. So that was very prosperous. It's just like on the way to Jaffa. And so this massacre took place, and in it, the instructions was to kill everybody: men, women, children, pregnant women. I mean, you have all kinds of stories coming out from this massacre here. And those who were not killed just were rounded up and paraded through Jerusalem by the Zionist forces. That time, they took over Western Jerusalem. And then later on, they were taken to a nearby quarry and executed.
That's right.
So this is how, so the massacre at the village, which was a home to an estimated 750 residents who lived in 144 homes. And this is according to the Institute for Palestine Studies, became one of the most horrific events to have impacted the exodus of Palestinians, because it was so close to Jerusalem. Now the news, remember, you didn't have an internet, you didn't have television. So when people started fleeing, and it was so close to Jerusalem, it drove other townships and villages into a major, basically, exodus and leaving.
Well, because of the fear that it instilled, and again, just to kind of put an emphasis on this. This occurred in April of 1948. There was no existence of Israel by that time, still, Jamal. So you had these murderous militia thugs, these Zionist thugs who would go around and commit these massacres. The Deir Yassin really was devastating in a lot of fronts, as you described, Jamal, but the psychological impact, as you kind of alluded to, on the surrounding villages and on Jerusalem must have been just extraordinary. And, the stories we hear around that time, people were living in fear. There's lots of stories about what was happening at that time. And just to go back to this, because it's really important, this was part of an orchestrated, well-planned, ethnic cleansing and murderous rampage by these thugs. This was not, all of a sudden Arabs invaded, Israel, and there's a war in 1948. I mean, this crazy narrative of the War of Independence that the Hasbaristas like to articulate. This was a plan that they had started years before 1948, Jamal. That needs to be emphasized over and over again to counteract the kind of misinformation and misnarrative that's has been put out by the supporters of the apartheid state for many decades now.
You're absolutely correct, Jess. And of course, this massacre in Deir Yassin, you can ask every single Palestinian, and they'll tell you a story that they've heard from their parents, from their grandparents, even the children know it.
Absolutely.
I recall it as a child. This is because I can tell you why, and it's something very important, aside from it being so close to Jerusalem. A friend and actually a relative of my father, Hind al-Husseini, she's very well-known Palestinian activist, Hind al-Husseini. She started a school called Dar al-Tifl, which literally means the children's home. And the reason she did that is because 55 young children were orphaned as a result of the massacre. So they brought them into Jerusalem. Their parents were killed. And she started that school, which still exists up till today. So the first generation, if you think about it, this first 55 children, those are children, say, from 2-year-old, 3-year-old, whatever. Those are the graduates of Dar al-Tifl. They are really the remnants of Deir Yassin, or those who were left to live, and then of course now it has become a famous school and an orphanage kind of house. But a single woman from Jerusalem started this because of this massacre. So everyone who passes by Dar al-Tifl in Jerusalem as a child, like, why did this school exist? It existed because of Deir Yassin, because of the massacre of Deir Yassin.
That's an incredible story, Jamal. those memories, because now we're going into the fourth generation of those children who had children, whose children had children, and are now having children too. That's an extraordinary story.
Yep, and that's why, like I said, I wanted to include Deir Yassin, even though I said earlier we want to talk about the lesser-known massacres. So let's move on to another one, which is in the village of Saliha, which the massacre happened on October 30th, 1948, and it was perpetrated by the Sheva, which in Hebrew means seventh brigade, basically. And this is, according to various accounts, including by the Haganah National Staff's Israel's Galilee, also Israeli historian Benny Morris, like some of these, you don't have survivors to talk about this from the Palestinian side. So you hear about them or read about them from the Israeli archives.
That's right.
They, in a, I don't know what they call this, just in a warped way, they documented their massacres. Usually the criminals don't like to leave the evidence, but they left the evidence.
No, not only did they have the evidence, it was extremely detailed. If you look at the new historians and the people who are having access to these archives, what's really extraordinary, Jamal, is the level of detail that the murderers, the criminals, the people who perpetrated these international war crimes, how well documented it was. It was truly extraordinary. On what would be considered a modern day spreadsheet, that's the level of detail that they have.
So, according to their documentation, they started to blow up some homes, and the villagers ran and hid inside a mosque. And then they blew up the mosque and started killing them. They killed 60 to 94 people who had taken refuge inside the mosque. And of course, then the village was completely depopulated. And I think there is now just one building standing, which used to be the school. And the village was very flat, so now they turn it into an agricultural land, for Israeli settlers, basically to plant trees and fruit trees in it. That's
disgusting.
Yeah,
frankly,
that's something that they basically bragged about.
Well, they bragged about it, they wrote about it, they kept good records of it, and all of that evidence of the war crimes that were committed, Jamal, are coming out 75 years on, will continue to come out. And the reason, we want to remind our listeners and viewers, the reason we do this is to, bring an element of the reality of the apartheid state, how it came into being, the kind of calculated effort to depopulate and ethnically cleanse Palestine for years before, the creation of the apartheid state in 1948. And you're only talking about we're only talking about 5 today, Jamal, right?
Yeah.
What if we talked about the 500?
We need days and months.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and this village, basically, it was actually it stood on talking about, because we started talking about the Galilee, which we'll come back to it, that they don't want Arabs living next to them.
In the Galilee.
This is a village in the upper Galilee. It's by a ravine called Wadi Saliha. That's what was named after. It's a steep wadi, which means a ravine. In the upper Galilee mountains, it goes near the border with Lebanon, and someone who you know well, Salman Abu Sitta, author of the Atlas of Palestine, estimated that the number of registered Palestinian refugees from Saliha in 2008 was more than 8,000 people.
That's incredible, Jamal. And we should let our listeners know that Salman Abu Sitta's documentation of the depopulated villages is probably the best empirical scientific treatise on the depopulation of Palestine that was ever written. we really want to encourage our listeners and viewers to check out Salman Abusetta's research. It's extraordinary.
And the last one I want to talk about is not a village. It's actually a prospering city. Because I don't talk about Haifa and Jaffa and Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, and all these places, and Akka, and we can go on and on. But I want to talk about one because people also know about this location and they hear about it, especially if they flew to Palestine and where do they land? What is now called?
Where do they land? That's right.
What is it now called? Ben-Gurion Airport. It's the lid.
Well, it's the lid.
Or Lidda, and even the Israelis refer to it as the Lod, but the lid, that was a prospering city on the way to Jaffa. And now, still it exists, but now they've taken a major part of that city. There was a small airport, by the way. The airport existed pre-1948, wasn't established by Ben-Gurion or by the Israelis. So there was actually an airport, a small airport there, and they expanded it. So now everyone hears about flying into Ben-Gurion. No, you're flying into the ethnically cleansed Palestinian city of Al-Lid. That's what we refer to it, which on July 9th, 1948, Zionist forces, they launched a large-scale military operation known as Operation Dani, that's the name, which aimed to occupy the cities of Lidda and Ramla, the two cities. Between July 9th and July 19th, the Israeli gangs and militias killed dozens of Palestinians, estimated more than 200. This is again according to Salman Abusetta's Atlas of Palestine. And a citywide massacre led to a death march or mass expulsion of Palestinians. You and I knew somebody who was basically, as a young child, arrested in that mass expulsion and put into holding camp.
Concentration camp.
You know who I'm talking about, Darwish Adas.
Yeah.
He's from one of the late presidents of the Arab Culture and Community Center. He talked about his story. So they gathered everybody after they started pillaging and killing people, and then basically they had what part of this a transfer operation. It's an organized transfer operation, which they gathered and expelled from Palestine between 60,000 and 70,000 inhabitants of the two towns and refugees from nearby villages, because from nearby villages now, which we gave examples of these villages, started running into Jaffa and Haifa and whatever bigger cities, and they went into the Lid to take refuge there, and they got expelled with them in that major transfer operation. And who was the director of the operation, Danny? Under the guidance of David Ben-Gurion, basically people like Yitzhak Rabin, remember?
That's right.
The one who won the Nobel Peace.
The Nobel Peace Prize
He
was an architect of massacre.
He was in charge of that expulsion of 60 to 70,000 Palestinians. 80 to 176 people were massacred in the Dahmash mosque. That's documented with machine guns, grenades, and rockets. Others were killed in other places, and the rest were expelled at gunpoint by Rabin in what became known as the Death March to Ramallah. That's why you have a lot of people who live in Ramallah from the Lid and from the Ramli. And I know you guys who originate from Ramallah kind of look down at them. Some say, "Oh, you're not." Well, some of them say, "You're not originally from Ramallah. You are from the Lid." That's how they ended up in Ramallah.
I know
the poor guys and women and children, and ended up living there. But they were.
Yeah, but you mentioned our colleague and our friend Darwish Adassi, but when Darwish, even some 70 years after this happened, Jamal, was very painful and difficult for him to talk about this event that tells you about the psychological impact and scar of the trauma at that time.
Jesse couldn't go back there, even as
he never could.
He had the opportunity to go. He couldn't gather enough courage to go there.
It's too painful. It's too painful. And it remains painful for a lot of Palestinians who were dispossessed from their homes and villages from 1948, from 1967 and afterwards, Jamal. The psychological impact, which we don't talk about, we haven't talked about that much, of the impact of these massacres and these mass expulsions is tremendous. It really is. And Darwish, was this incredible man, with an incredible life, who was so scarred by this, as you said, he could never go back.
Yeah. You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco, 89.5 FM. We can talk about this forever, Jess, but we wanted to give our audience just a sampling of these massacres. These are real massacres, and that's why it's very painful for Palestinians to remember this. And so when you hear politicians congratulating Israel on its 75th anniversary, this is our Nakba. This is basically the catastrophe that was committed against Palestinians in 1948 and before 1948, started before 1948. And Israel, it wasn't as how the media tries to represent it, the independence of Israel. Independence of what? They've taken over our land, our homes, ethnically cleansed the people there. And they bury their heads in the sand, and the politicians and their and the Israel lobby surrogates in the United States, they pretend that these massacres have never existed. And then when you try to talk about these massacres, or you try to talk about the existing Israeli apartheid, they start accusing you of anti-Semitism, as we have been seeing now.
Well, that's a good segue to our next segment, Jamal, because we draw a line from the massacres of the Nakba from 1948, 75 years, and where we are today. You have an increased kind of aggressive stance by the Hasbaristas, by the pro-Israel lobby. They're so scared right now and so anxious. They want to rework the definition of anti-Semitism. They're attacking what appears to be mostly Palestinian and pro-Palestinian women right now, because we've talked about a Palestinian professor at the University of Washington. We're going to talk about this law student at CUNY, City University in New York. I mean, they're coming after women and Palestinians and pro-Palestine academics and people who have been, pulling back the screen of all of these attempts to hide the atrocities of 1948, leading up to 1948, and everything since. And now there's a even stronger effort to call out the apartheid state. And we have an example of a commencement address at the law school at City University, New York, by Fatima Muhammad. I listened to it, I watched it, and I listened to it because now it's back online. Extraordinary commencement address. She was selected by her own classmates to do this. And of course, the Hasbaristas, the pro-Israel voices, are having seizures about her speech, Jamal. It's unbelievable.
Which, by the way, I should mention that we're hoping to have Fatima Muhammad come on the show and tell her own story. However, we'll attempt to shed light on what happened based on what we've seen, what we've heard, what we've read.
But Jamal, it's not complicated.
No, it's not complicated. But I'd like her to come.
She's a law school. She's a law school graduate at an excellent law school. She was selected by her classmates to give a commencement address.
And the commencement, and you're very familiar with this. The school has nothing to do with the selection. Right, the students get to select. So they basically, her colleagues, her friends, the other students put her on a pedestal, basically, to represent them all. And one more thing, I should mention that Fatima is not Palestinian. She's not. She's her family came from Yemen. Okay, so she's Fatima Muhammad. Basically, she went on the podium, draped in the famous Palestinian keffiyeh, and every single commencement address, Jess, if you go back since they started filming those, you could find them. So this is the commencement address, I guess would be 2023, because this happened on May 12th.
Right.
You'll find it.
Right.
You won't find 2022, because the commencement address that happened was given by a Palestinian American student, and her video lasted for a year until this incident happened. So because it just happened, the students to select Fatima this year, and the year before they selected Palestinian American, and both of them were activists involved in the BDS movement, and just like all students on campus.
Right. But my point is that, and you made it, I'm just driving it home. She was selected by her colleagues, by her peers, precisely because they knew about her commitment to justice, precisely because they knew about her views on what's happening in Palestine. She was selected because of her commitment to justice and articulating those views. She wasn't just like, who is this? We're going to select this woman. We don't know who she is or what she represents.
Everybody knew her.
She's a very well-known activist, law school student, did very well at CUNY, and is well respected by the majority of her classmates. That's why she was elected. Not selected, Jamal, elected, because they're put to a vote. People vote for who they want. It's not selected, it's elected, which is even I think even a higher standard, actually. So, but the response has been, the response was predictable and extreme, right?
So I have to ask you something, because you watched the video. You've mentioned it's back on, but did you watch it on YouTube?
It was YouTube.
Okay, so it's back on YouTube, because initially the law school brought it back. There is they brought it, and then but it was taken from YouTube. Anyway, going back, the videos of the commencements from 2014, this is when they started posting them on YouTube, to 2021 are all available on the school's YouTube page. You should check the YouTube you watch if it is the school's YouTube page, or other people took it and posted it again.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I don't know that answer.
So in last year, when I mentioned this, the graduation speaker, the other speaker of 2022 commencement was Nardine Kiswani. She's a Palestinian activist and the founder of Within Our Lifetime Palestine. And like Fatima Muhammad, Kiswani's speech also called out Israel's human rights violations against Palestinians, and again, he mysteriously disappeared. I mean, you could see that just in the case, as you and I, we have talked to professors, Georgetown, George Washington University, San Francisco State University. You get all, I don't know, the president or the provost, they get these mysterious calls, and all of a sudden they change their position, because CUNY, the law school, they passed a resolution supporting BDS.
That's right.
So that was, this school and the students. And I should say one more thing: the Jewish students, or the CUNY School of Law Jewish Law Students Association, wrote a letter in support of Fatima Muhammad, and I'm quoting here, and they said it is disingenuous to characterize these factual descriptions as anti-Semitic when they describe the conditions of Palestinian life. And then they go on to say, if CUNY Law wants to show it cares for its Jewish students, it can do so by showing it cares for Fatima, which I think was very...
It's an incredible statement.
Yes.
Yeah, but isn't it interesting that the official statement from CUNY conveniently left out the CUNY law school student, Jewish law school student statement? You don't hear that statement. You don't read it anywhere because it's such a powerful statement coming from CUNY Law School Jewish Student Association. It's a great statement, and that's being, when the JDL and the ADL and when the JCRC are going crazy about Fatima's commencement speech, they conveniently leave out what the Jewish law school students at CUNY have said. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, they leave out a lot of things and they distort
reality.
Distort the facts. But also it was very important for Fatima Muhammad, which, I mean, she was an activist. She stands for justice. She's a lawyer, for God's sake. I mean, now hopefully she'll get a great job and she'll have a great career ahead of her. It's not like, someone who knows what's injustice. I mean, you study, that's part of the law, to know, to kind of identify justice and injustice. And what drove her, according to an interview she had, was, and I'm quoting from her, is the cold-blooded murder of Shireen Abu Akleh precisely highlights the glaring and disturbing dehumanization of the Palestinian people by the U.S. government. So she goes on about that because she doesn't only hold apartheid Israel accountable, she holds the United States accountable for not standing with an American citizen who was murdered in cold blood. I mean, a very moving statement, Jess. And again, I've mentioned earlier that last year the faculty, and this is important, the faculty of the CUNY School of Law passed a resolution unanimously endorsing the boycott, sanctions, and divestment BDS movement, which, as everybody knows, is a nonviolent initiative that seeks to challenge Israel's occupation and abuse of Palestinian human rights through economic, cultural, and academic boycotts, similar to the successful boycott campaigns of apartheid South Africa. So I don't see where the crime in this, Jess.
Well, here's the crime, Jamal. It's called the crime of reality. It's called the crime of speaking the truth. It's called the crime of holding the apartheid state accountable for its atrocities. And not that we need any more kind of hypocrisy or any more information to call out, as Fatima did, holding the United States accountable for the complicity in the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. We now have a Justice Minister, Justice Minister Levine, basically pleading with Israeli Supreme Court justices to understand that Jews don't want to live with Arabs, and they should be able to support that. It's mind-boggling in its craziness, Jamal, because the level of racism, the level of anti-democratic, the level of just like outright institutionalized hate that the apartheid state has for Palestinians is so glaring here. And this is completely missed in the media portrayal of what's happening in the apartheid state right now. This is this is not just anybody, Jamal. This is a justice minister.
He's a justice minister in the fascist government of Benjamin Netanyahu. But anyway, he's also the chief architect of the suspended judicial overhaul legislation. That's why Israelis are demonstrating in Tel Aviv. And this is what we're talking about. It's not quoted, it's actually recorded. He told the cabinet on Sunday that the Supreme Court must feature justices who, between quotes, understand why Jewish Israelis would not be prepared to live with Arabs in mixed localities. And this is his quote again from him. Arabs buy apartments in Jewish communities in the Galilee, and this causes Jews to leave these cities because they are not prepared to live with Arabs. We need to ensure that the Supreme Court has justices who understand this. In other words, we need more racist justices who would pass laws, basically,
Hey, Joe Biden, are you listening? Hey, Anthony Blinken, are you listening? Hey, Chuck Schumer, are you listening? Hey, Hakim Jeffries, are you listening? Is anybody listening to this craziness?
No, they're just happy to travel. Hakim Jeffries, happy to travel and for photo op. And then we have, sadly, which we talked about it last time, our own mayor in San Francisco, London Breed, traveling to Haifa, which we talked about. This is a major Palestinian city which was ethnically cleansed in 1948. And just to say we have sister cities. At the time when you have an American journalist was murdered there, at the time when they were bombing Gaza. And I mean, that's the reality here. I don't know. I mean, what can you say to someone like Hakim Jeffrey, who knows the experience of the African American community in this country?
I'll tell you. Someone confronted Hakim the other day, Hakim Jeffries, on some of these apartheid conditions, racist apartheid conditions of his beloved support of apartheid Israel, and he said, and I'm quoting, "Oh, I have no knowledge of that."
Wow. No TV. He must live, in total darkness, no television, no internet, no social media. He hasn't seen any of that.
He's a piece of work. He's an African-American, minority leader in the Congress with a name like Hakim, who has no knowledge of the atrocities that are being committed.
Hakim means the wise guy, by the way.
Yeah.
The wise man.
The wise man. Very wise of him to say, oh, he wasn't aware or had no knowledge of these apartheid practices. Right, Hakim. That's why you became a minority leader in the Congress of the Democrats, because you have no knowledge of these things. Yeah. Like anybody is going to believe you, man. Come on.
Well, anyway, this is the beginning. I think the situation on the ground is getting worse. We don't have the time even to talk about it, but these so-called Israeli leaders, like Itamar Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and others, are calling for a second Nakba. And we started the show talking about the 75th anniversary of the Nakba, but they are actually talking about the second Nakba. We don't have time to discuss this, Jess.
Right, and they're making matters worse, as you and I know. We don't have time, but it's too bad. But they're going to Al-Aqsa, they're going to the Haram Sharif, they're going to Al-Aqsa Mosque, in deliberate provocations against all the international agreements and conventions about this kind of behavior, and they're being so provocative. They want to provoke another Nakba, Jamal. That's exactly what they're doing. You're right.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we will speak to you next week.
See you next week.